Hello, the lesson for this week is on Indigenous societies. One thing we'll remember, all of us, I'm pretty sure, Danny, is that this story of the Atlantic world that we're unfolding in this course is a story of interconnected cultures and interconnected economies. One of the chief examples of this that we looked at in the last module was the history of the Atlantic slave trade, which moved millions of people in coerced fashion from Africa into the Americas, both the Caribbean, South America, and North America. For the history of the indigenous peoples of North America that we're going to be focusing on in this lesson, we do need to pay a little bit of attention or remember that there was a history too of indigenous coerced labor slavery. That was a history of slavery that, well, was complicated by the spread of diseases from Europe into the Americas, which wiped out too much of this forced population of slaves. So the history of disease plays a role in the background to what we're looking at in this week's lesson.
When you read Columbus's early accounts, and he's imagining plantations at the time, he's imagining indigenous people being those laborers. There's no thought of bringing Africans across. Why would you bring Africans across the sea? That seems foolish when you have all these people right here. But as those people die off in the millions, well, there's debates on those numbers, but certainly in the thousands and thousands, it becomes clear to them that this is simply not going to work. That they will need other sources of labor for the story. To run those plantations. So disease is really, really important to the story, and it's important too to the way historians have told the story. Some historians, some early historians, and we look briefly at Amos Adams, an 18th century historian, one of New England's first chroniclers. And he writes, and the role of God in this is always remarkable. He writes, I don't know if I can get this quote exact, but something to the effect that God was pleased to send a dreadful disease amongst the natives of the area. And so when these English settlers are arriving in the early 17th century, they're seeing an empty lot. They're seeing an empty place that they can populate. And they think God has done this for them. And if you see this again in the 19th century, people talk about manifest destiny. That God has said that this is our destiny to conquer this entire continent and to make it ours. And so the fact that these are weakened societies, that these have been decimated by disease, allows them to tell that story in a way that seems plausible in their imagination. So it's really, really important. It raises all kinds of questions, though, about perspective and the perspective of our sources. And so if we're going to look at indigenous societies, if we're going to treat indigenous societies seriously and try to understand them at all as actors in this story, we have a lot of problems. We have very few sources to work with, and most of the sources we have to work with are European sources.
The same challenge that we had in looking at early African societies and their encounters with European traders and slave traders.
Exactly. So in the painting that you're seeing behind us, this is a very early colonial work. It's by a Dutch painter, Jan, Michael, help me with my Dutch here, Mostart, not close enough. And you see a kind of imaginary New World landscape. Mostart had never been, this is 1530s, I think this painting is done. And Mostart had never been to the New World. He had read a couple of early accounts of the New World. He had heard some stories. And so between kind of biblical imagery and a kind of notion of primitive societies that exists in most civilizations, he imagined these as kind of primitive cave dwellers like you see here. And the important point for us to think about is that that source informs how, not all Europeans saw this, but there are lots of other paintings like this. It informs how Europeans imagined indigenous people lived. So it really structures their imaginations. We face the same thing in the written documents as well. Some of them are written by people that are in the New World, seeing it very much through their own lenses, seeing it very much through their own prejudiced, biased positions. And we can talk about that a little bit later. But it means that we're always looking at one group of people through another group of people's eyes. And that's as you said, the problem that we face in the early modern African module as well. So this is a challenge for us in this kind of course.
So this week we're going to deal with one particular question, and that is the question then, what, as you said, can we learn about indigenous societies from looking at these European sources. And there's another dimension, maybe a perspective that we do need to pay attention to as well. We've not got just the perspective of the primary sources with different interests for each author, different backgrounds, different experiences, but we've also got the work of two historians, Salisbury and Paul.
Daniel Paul and Neil Salisbury, yes.
So the challenge then is both historical and historiographical.
Right.
So when you read the primary sources and analyze them and make contributions in the forum for this week, what you should also be doing is thinking about how your analysis of the primary sources contributes in some way, either by agreeing with an important point that Paul or Salisbury make, or maybe modifying a point if you can find some complicating evidence, or even pointing out where there might be some kind of a mistake or some perspective that you can, a claim in Paul or Salisbury that you might be able to disagree with. If you have good reasons, if you have good evidence based in some particular primary sources, you can point that out.
And these two secondary works we're reading are two very interesting works. Let's talk about them very, very briefly here.
Yeah.
And they'll help us to allow us to think a bit about perspective. And we're talking about the perspectives within the primary documents, but historians have perspectives too. Historians have worldviews. Historians think about things differently. They understand, think differently. They take different questions to the material. So they're facing the same challenge that you're facing, we're facing in this course. We're reading primary documents. We're trying to make sense of it. We try to tell a story. They're doing the exact same thing. They have no kind of magic way of doing this. They do it more than a student might, but they still face the same challenge of how to interpret it, which sources to choose, which ones to emphasize, which ones not to emphasize. Paul's perspective is particularly interesting, and his perspective comes out very, very clearly in his title. The title is We, and that's the emphasis here, we were not the savages. Daniel Paul is himself a Mi'kmaq man from Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
He's done fabulous research, extensive research, but he's making a really simple point. Traditional historical accounts emphasize the fact that Indians were savage peoples who inflicted grievous injury on innocent white people coming into the land. And he says, no, this is not the case. And he's trying to make a case, documented a case, that shows that the savagery was very much on the part of the European colonizers, not on the part of his people. So he's got a very clear perspective there. He's saying a we, and of course many students will say, oh, you can never say we, you can never say I. It's always got to be objective. And he's saying, no, I am part of this we. This is part of my story. So very, very important. Salisbury, on the other hand, is, as an academic historian based in a university, using traditional methods, he has no particular political position from which he begins his positioning on this, which is not to say he's unbiased. It's just to say he doesn't have a kind of obvious feature like Paul does. But he tries to also answer some basic questions about Indigenous history. And his perspective is really interesting too. A lot of these older accounts, older historical accounts, begin with that kind of notion of America as an empty place, that it's a vacant lot. In fact, we read John Cotton, who says, in a vacant soil, describes it as this empty land. He's saying that's simply not the case, that historians are walking into existing histories. They're walking into existing stories. And what Europeans are doing is interacting with those stories. And that sure, by the late 19th century, you can begin to see a complete dominance by the European cultures over the indigenous peoples. But for the first 200 or 300 years, that's simply not true. And there is an interconnected series of stories there. And his point is we need to try to understand those. I want to make one really quick point. Mike and I have just been talking about this for some time. As students are reading this, you should not be thinking that we've set these people up to be radically different. They're not radically different. These are both, in a generic sense, sympathetic to an indigenous position. That one is not a racist. Don't walk down that kind of road as you read these things. But there are still different perspectives there. Both of them are doing their job as well as they can, but from different perspectives. And that's what we want to think about in this case.
So we could say, to put this maybe a little too strongly, both Salisbury and Paul are biased.
Yeah, well, but in the same way that everybody is biased.
And that bias, rather than being a bad thing, might actually help them
precisely.
Provide insight, unique, scholarly, personal insight into the meaning and significance of the sources.
Yeah.
We all have to make choices when we look at sources. We all have to make interpretive decisions.
So when you're looking at Paul and when you're looking at Salisbury, think about a couple of things. look for differences in perspective. Look for opportunities to see the difference. Now we're in the forum, we're asking one group of you to read Paul and one group of you to read Salisbury. So you won't be making this comparison yourself. But in your responses in the forum, we'll expect you to describe their positions, to describe the ideas and stories that they're bringing out, and look for differences in that kind of fashion. So try to find differences there. And then you can ask, well, is this a reflection of a bias? Is this a reflection of a perspectival difference between these authors, or are they just kind of looking at different things? And we can talk about that. Also raises questions, though, about, and Paul in particular helps us think about this. Can you be too close to your subject matter? So a lot of people will say, you need to be distanced from your subject. And maybe Daniel Paul, because he's Mi'kmaq, can't actually look at the story objectively. Reasonable question to ask. But we could also turn that question on its head and say, well, maybe Neil Salisbury is too far from those civilizations. Maybe he can't understand them. Maybe he can't see what Daniel Paul can see. So there's, again, interesting questions related to perspective.
And when you try to answer big questions like that, or more specific questions, if you can, always turn to the primary sources for support and for evidence, for material to discuss.
Excellent. Interesting stuff this week. Look forward to it.
Go to it.